And I mean, we've covered the somatic nervous system a good deal. Just FYI, I sent an email regarding why. Okay, I think I read it. Yes, I just didn't get a chance to respond. I did get your email. I had one of my students trying to pawn off a cat on me today. So they're really, as a kitten. It's a nice little kitten. Does anyone have cats? You want another one? No, this one's a nice small little calico. But I prefer girls. I heard boys spray. So I'm like, I don't want anything in my house. And we have leather couches, so I don't trust cats with the claws and everything.
I have some older cat, but she does good.
Really? Well, and again, I just don't want them to claw because I'd like to have an indoor-outdoor cat so they can come and go. Anyways, let's talk about the autonomic nervous system here a little bit. We talked briefly about it last class, and you're going to see now, let me just show you the picture. The somatic nervous system is relatively a little bit more easy to understand, okay? You've got your sensory neuron coming from the receptor. Remember chapter 1, we had the receptor control center effector. Basically very similar, all right, when we're talking about the somatic nervous system. You've got your receptor, sends the sensory information to the control center, which in this diagram is the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord interprets it, figures out how it wants to respond to whatever the stimulus is, and then it sends its response message down to the effector organ, in this case it's skeletal muscle. Pretty easy. We get in the autonomic nervous system, now it's going to get a little bit more difficult in regards to the motor aspect of it. Okay? The sensory aspect is pretty much the same. You're going to have a stimulus. That receptor is going to monitor that stimulus, and then it's going to send that information to our control center, be it the brain or the spinal cord, and then we're going to elicit some sort of response. Okay? And the response is a little bit more, I don't know, not going to say difficult, there's just more to it. Okay? So, that being said, quick review for the autonomic, the somatic versus the autonomic. All right, so when we talk about, remember, when we have a motor response, all right, or a motor pathway, all right, that we've talked about in chapter 14, you have usually 2 neurons, sometimes 3, okay, if there's an inner neuron, but you have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron, okay? So just to review here, the lower motor neuron, okay, is going to be a single motor neuron that's going to extend, in this case, our central nervous system being the spinal cord, but it also can be from the brainstem if it's one of our cranial nerves, okay? And it's going to extend out to the effector, and in this case, the only effector tissue for somatic motor neurons is skeletal muscle. If you don't know that by now, please learn it when you go home tonight, because you need to know that, okay? So the cell body, all right, of the lower motor neuron will be found in the brainstem if we're talking about cranial nerves. If we're talking about spinal nerves, it'll be found in the spinal cord, okay? Important that you also know this, because we're going to talk about this when we get into the autonomic nervous system, all right? These lower motor neurons are myelinated, and they're pretty big, okay? Remember we were talking about the withdrawal reflex, and we were talking about the stretch reflex. We were talking about alpha motor neurons, all right? Alpha motor neurons are the big mama jambas. Those are the biggest, largest diameter motor nerves. So that means that they transmit, all right? Their nerve signal is the fastest, okay? Also, our lower motor neuron, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, okay? And it will always excite the muscle tissue, okay? You need to know those facts, okay? Because things differ a little bit now when we're going to get into the autonomic nervous system, okay? So like I said, I feel like the somatic nervous system is easier, okay? Cut and dry. Now when we get into the autonomic nervous system, did I skip a slide? Make sure I didn't skip a slide. Nope, okay. All right, now when we're talking about the lower motor neuron, we're adding a second one to it. So there's 2. It's plural. So we have lower motor neurons. Okay? So the effector chain is going to be made up of 2 motor neurons before we get to our effector. Now, first and foremost, I will say this again today. All right? The 3 effector tissue or organs for the autonomic nervous system is going to be cardiac muscle tissue, smooth, oh, bummer, smooth muscle tissue, and glands. Okay? You have to know that. Okay? So somatic nervous system, easy. Skeletal muscle. Autonomic nervous system, all right, the effectors are going to be cardiac muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and glands. Okay? All right. So in the motor aspect, okay, in the motor portion here of our autonomic nervous system, okay, we have two lower motor neurons. The first one, all right, you're going to hear me calling this, so know it now, is the preganglionic neuron. Okay? Because what a ganglion, just to remind you, is a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. And when you get a clustering of cell bodies, most likely you're going to have synapses there. Okay? Synapses. So the preganglionic neuron, its cell body, again, is going to be either in the brainstem, if we're talking about our cranial nerves, or spinal cord. Good, right? So far, so good. Okay. Difference between the somatic motor neuron and the autonomic motor neuron, all right, is the somatic was myelinated but large, all right. The preganglionic neuron here, all right, and the autonomic will also be myelinated, all right, but it's going to be smaller, thinner, okay. Won't transmit as fast, but still fast because it's all measured in milliseconds, so it's still fast, all right. So this neuron is going to travel from the brain or the spinal cord out to a ganglion somewhere. We'll talk about the different places for the ganglion. All right, this is my drawing. This is the cell body here, all right, and this is going to be the terminal end, okay, or the synapses. This is actually the symbol for a synapse. This right here. Okay. So the preganglionic neuron is this guy here. And then the second neuron is known as the postganglionic neuron. That's this one. Okay? Makes sense, right? The neuron before the ganglion is pre. The one after the neuron, or after the ganglion, is post. Okay? So the book refers to it also as ganglionic. All right? You'll hear me use this one much more. Okay, I think it's easier to remember what it is when I'm saying postganglionic, because then you know it's after the ganglion. Okay, so in this situation now, when we're discussing the postganglionic neuron, or the second neuron, its cell body is going to be found in what we call an autonomic ganglion. We're going to learn all those different ganglions, okay? But they're somewhere in the periphery. They're outside, okay, of the spinal cord. Okay? Now, this neuron is unmyelinated, okay? So the preganglionic is myelinated and thin. The postganglionic is unmyelinated, and it's also thin. But it is going to travel from the autonomic ganglion to these tissues here. I pray that if there is questions on the test in regards to the tissues that are innervated by the autonomic nervous system, that every single one of you folks, and that's for you at home, and for everybody else that's taking my class, that you get 100 on that. Because I feel like I've been banging that out to you guys. Bam, bam, bam. I'm feeling pretty good that you guys will get it. All right. So, sorry, let me go back to the preganglionic. I got all excited here about the preganglionic neuron. I forgot to mention the neurotransmitter. All right. The preganglionic neuron will release acetylcholine, all right, from its synaptic knob, which is always excitatory. So that's similar to what we saw in the somatic nervous system, okay? But now when we get to the postganglionic neuron, all right, the postganglionic neuron can release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. Two different ones, okay? So in that situation, it can either excite or inhibit the effector. Okay? So that's different. Remember, in the in the somatic nervous system there, that motor neuron always excited the effector. In this situation, depending on what neurotransmitter is involved and what receptors are involved, all right, it can either excite the effector or inhibit the effector. Okay, so keep that one in mind. So there's some major differences here. So let me show you a picture because I love pictures. Give you a second to write something down here as I'm taking a sip. All right, here's a picture of these lower motor neurons. Okay, so here's our first lower motor neuron. This is the preganglionic lower motor neuron. This example is showing the cell body being in the spinal cord, but it can also be in the brainstem somewhere if we're talking about a cranial nerve. Okay, and you can see it extends out of the spinal cord. It is myelinated. Okay, there's little white structures there. Those are Schwann cells. That's representing myelination. All right, and then they're going to synapse onto the postganglionic neuron, and where they do, it's called an autonomic ganglion. A couple different locations. And then from that autonomic ganglion, the postganglionic neuron, all right, oh, excuse me, let me back up. The neurotransmitter that's being released from the preganglionic neuron onto the postganglionic neuron is acetylcholine. That will excite the postganglionic neuron, and then it will travel from the autonomic ganglion, all right, to the effector organ, okay, where it will release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine, where its effect can be excitatory or inhibitory. Good so far? Am I going too slow? Okay. All right. Which brings me to this concept here of neuroconvergence and neurodivergence. All right. There is an advantage, all right, that the autonomic nervous system has having two neurons, lower motor neurons, all right, or two neuron chain, all right, and it's lower motor neuron, all right, and that brings up neuronal convergence and then neuronal divergence, okay? So what neuronal convergence is, we can have multiple or many preganglionic neurons that can synapse onto one ganglionic neuron, okay, which is good. And for simple example, all right, if it's a 1-to-1 ratio, okay, if you cut the preganglionic neuron, you're screwed, all right? But in this scenario, if you have multiple preganglionic neurons and you cut one, no problem. You get several others that can still excite the postganglionic neuron, okay? All right, neural divergence, all right, this is when we see, okay, branches from the axon of the preganglionic neuron, all right, so these type of neurons, if you remember back to chapter, was it 10 or 12? 12, when we were learning about the neurons, all right, you have your multipolar neuron, but you briefly heard me talk about that the axon can have what we call axon collaterals. And those axon collaterals can come off, okay? And then they can go out and stimulate many postganglionic neurons in other locations, okay? That comes into effect later on when we talk about mass activation. That's an advantage that the sympathetic nervous system has, that fight or flight system, okay? So when you're running, all right, or trying to get away from a dangerous scenario, okay, this type of setup allows for your nervous signals to spread out across your body as quickly as possible, which is ideal, okay? So you can have this one neuron, it shoots out all its different collaterals, which will then synapse on several other neurons, postganglionic neurons, all throughout the body. So you can get a quicker response to whatever it is. All right. So let's jump into our autonomic nervous system here, okay? I do want to talk about a few things, all right? First of all right, the brain and the spinal cord, all right, are going to be the structural components in the autonomic nervous system. They play a huge role, all right? But a huge player, and we talked about this when we were going over in chapter 13, all right, the many different functions and characteristics of the hypothalamus, is that the hypothalamus is going to control both the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, parasympathetic is the rest and digest, chilling out, relaxing, eating, all right, and then restoring your fuel sources. Sympathetic is the fight or flight. Run like heck to get away from whatever it is that's trying to kill you, chase you, whatever. If you're about to get into a car accident and you see it happening, your body's going to be releasing tons of fight or flight hormone response chemicals to help deal with that situation. Okay, but at the same time, okay, the hypothalamus is part of our limbic system. It is going to govern some of the emotional responses, all right, to those fight or flight mechanisms. Like fear, that's a wonderful emotion to have, especially if you're running away from something, like a bear chasing you, okay? The hypothalamus is going to help to process that. So when we're dealing with the autonomic nervous system, we're going to be involving the cerebral cortex, the thalamus, our big relay and filter system, and then our limbic system, again, our emotions, okay? In the brainstem, and we'll talk about this later on near the end of this chapter, right, we have several nuclei that are going to govern some of the visceral reflexes. Now, visceral reflexes has to do with, perfect example, if your blood pressure gets too high or your heart rate gets too high, how do your blood vessels respond to that, okay? To make sure that your blood pressure doesn't skyrocket and you die. Or the digestive system, okay? How you handle eating, all right, and then knowing when it's time to stop eating. How do you know when it's time to pee? How do you know when it's time to poop? Those are all visceral reflexes, okay? And in some cases, the spinal cord plays a role in some of those visceral reflexes also, okay? We'll talk about this near the end. Going to the urination and defecation, all right? Those are spinal cord reflexes. That's why if you suffer a spinal cord injury, all right, specifically in your neck and thoracic spine, you can actually lose the ability to control your bowel and bladder habits, okay? All right, this picture here just shows you everything that's involved here and what I was just talking about, okay? All right, let's jump in and talk about the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. You need to know these, parasympathetic and sympathetic, okay? So parasympathetic, rest and digest. So just after you eat and you kind of hang out, all right, you are going to be stimulating your parasympathetic division, all right, quite nicely, okay? Its job is to replenish any depleted fuel sources, okay? If you are in the process of, well, you've just eaten, okay, we need to restore glycogen levels, okay, and then we need to conserve energy, all right, for that period of time when we need to expend that energy, okay? And then that brings in to play the sympathetic division. That's the fight or flight. This is the one that you're literally exercising when you exercise, all right? But when you get excited, all right, you get that feeling in your stomach for Christmas or whatever, the butterflies there, or in a situation that you're put into that is a dangerous situation, an emergency type of situation, right? You will be utilizing your sympathetic division, okay? So this next slide that I want to go over, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this next slide because I want to go over the differences between the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, all right? They're pretty much, not always, but they can pretty much be antagonistic of one another, okay? So this slide kind of breaks it down, okay? So on the left side there, we have our parasympathetic nervous system, and then on the right side, we have the sympathetic. Believe it or not, too many of us spend too much time stimulating our sympathetic nervous system, okay? Which is, there's some studies going on that are talking about that might be too dangerous and causing long-term health issues, okay? So I always try to encourage people to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. That's why I'm always telling them when they're sad to eat. If they're happy to eat, all right? If you're angry, eat. Just keep eating. No, I'm just kidding. I never tell people to do that, all right? But can you imagine? You ever see that movie Wall-E? Remember how the people were in the future? You know, that's what it would be like. Anyways, Another name for the parasympathetic nervous system, okay, is the cranial sacral division. And I'll explain to you why that is. And then for the sympathetic, we call that the thoracolumbar. Okay? So when we're dealing with the parasympathetic, all right, we're going to be talking about, all right, the preganglionic axons here first. So in the parasympathetic, we get some of our preganglionic neurons, all right, are going to come off of the brainstem. Now, remember what I said, when you hear me say brainstem, you should be thinking cranial nerves, okay? Specifically, there's 4 cranial nerves, and you need to know them, right? There's cranial, I'm not going to write the Roman numerals out just because it'll take too long, all right? Cranial nerve number 3, okay? Cranial nerve number 7. Cranial nerve number 3 is oculomotor. Cranial nerve number 7 is facial. Cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal. And cranial nerve number 10, one of my favorites, vagus. Those 3 make up the cranial division. Okay? The sacral division comes from S2 through 4. Okay? The preganglionic neurons that come off of the S2 through 4 spinal nerves make up the sacral division. Does that make sense? Now you can see why we call it the cranial sacral division. Okay, those 4 cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10, okay, make up the cranial division, and then S2 through S4 of the spinal nerves makes up the sacral division. So the general characteristics of the preganglionic axons, all right, in the parasympathetic nervous system, all right, the preganglionic now are long, okay? They're very long. The postganglionic are short, okay? I'm going to draw the heart here because that's the easiest thing for me to draw. Which means that the autonomic ganglia for the parasympathetic nervous system, those autonomic ganglia are going to be close to the effector organ, all right? They could be just next to it, just on top of it, or inside the wall of whatever the effector organ is, all right? They call that intramural, okay? So that's what we're saying here. The ganglia are close or within the effector organ, okay? And then the preganglionic axons have very few collateral branches, not many. Okay, so that's the parasympathetic. We go over here to the sympathetic. We call that the thoracolumbar division. The preganglionic neurons reside in the lateral horns of T1 through L2. Now, you may not remember this, but when we were labeling the gray matter in lab class on Tuesday, I said that the lateral gray horn is only present from the levels of T1 to L2. Okay? So that's true. That's where these preganglionic neurons come from. Their cell bodies reside in the lateral horns there of T1 through L2. Now, the preganglionic axons in this situation, they are short. I do that completely wrong. All right? So the cell bodies sit in the lateral horn, okay, but they are short. And the postganglionic neurons are very long, okay? So the autonomic ganglia in the sympathetic nervous system are close to the spinal cord, all right? They're either going to be lateral to it. Well, you remember that structure that was lateral to the spine? It's the last slide that you labeled. The sympathetic chain. Remember the sympathetic chain? It sits outside the spine on either side. Sympathetic chain or sympathetic ganglion, either or trunk, excuse me. Okay, and it looks like a pearl necklace. It was that structure in the head, the pink globs, and then a yellow, and then another pink glob. It looks like a pearl necklace. That's an awful drawing, but you know what I mean. Okay, and it sits outside the spine, but it's close to the spine. Okay, and then we'll see some of the autonomic ganglion that will sit directly in front of the spine. Okay. But in this situation, those preganglionic axons, all right, have tons of collaterals. Because remember, I told you about that mass effect. All right, we got to get our signal out there. So we're going to send action potentials down the main axon, but then it's going to jet off of those axon collaterals and then synapse on many postganglionic neurons. Okay? All right, so this picture here in your book is awesome. Pretty much says everything that I just went over. I would look this over. Okay? Start on the parasympathetic, all right? Cranial sacral division. You can see here are those 4 cranial nerves I was telling you about, 3, 7, 9, and 10. All right, they're all here off of the brainstem, right? So they make up the cranial division, okay? And then all the way down here at the bottom, all right, we've got our S2 through S4 segments, all right, that come off, all right, that makes up the sacral division, okay? Definitely know the functions, all right? Rest and digest, conserve and restore energy or nutrient stores, okay? And then you can see here what they look like, all right? The preganglionic neuron is nice and long, all right? And the postganglionic neuron is short. So the autonomic ganglion are going to be close to the effector organ. Conversely, move over here to the sympathetic division, okay? We call it the thoracolumbar. That makes sense because all those neurons there, all right, are found within T1 all the way down to L2. They reside in the lateral gray horns there of the spinal cord, okay? And they'll exit out, and then their ganglions are going to be close. Like here's the spinal cord. Here are those autonomic ganglion for the sympathetic nervous system. They're close by, okay? So the preganglionic neuron is short. Here's a bunch of those collaterals, and then the postganglionic neuron is long, okay? And keep in mind the functions of the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, okay? Emergencies, exercising, all right? Increases your alertness, your metabolic activities, okay? Questions so far? Not too bad? Okay. Okay. So that brings us to, when we're talking about the differences, the degree of response from these 2 divisions, all right? Think of the parasympathetic nervous system division. Its effect will be pretty local, okay? And it's because, all right, those preganglionic neurons don't have all those those collaterals that are coming off. The sympathetic, all right, this is because of all those collaterals that come off, will utilize mass activation, okay? So we can simultaneously activate several different effectors, all right? Cardiac muscle, any of the smooth muscles, all right? Glandular response, all right? Especially if we're trying to stimulate, all right, that fight or flight response, okay? You got to pump out that adrenaline from the adrenal gland here. Okay, and we're going to actually talk about the pathway for the sympathetic stimulation of the adrenal gland. All right, it's really cool. Keep in mind, the more synapses that you have in a neuron chain, the slower the response time is. All right, remember a monosynaptic reflex, all right, will happen quicker than a polysynaptic reflex because there's fewer synapses. All right, when we get to sympathetic stimulation of the adrenal gland, it's going to blow your mind. Okay, all right. So let's start off and talk about the parasympathetic division here, okay? Remember, our goal, the autonomic nervous system, well, your whole body's nervous system and the endocrine system is to always maintain homeostasis, all right? That's that ideal range, that optimal range that all systems in your body function within, okay? Blood pressure, 90/60 to 140/90 is that range, that normal range for your blood pressure. So your body's always going to be trying to keep your blood pressure in that range. Optimally, not optimally, but ideally it's going to try to keep it around 120/80, okay? So, all right, when we're talking about homeostasis, we're going to be talking about parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division and how they affect that homeostasis, all right? So when we talk about the parasympathetic, this is going to be everything that when you're resting, like when you're sleeping tonight, okay? Your parasympathetic nervous system should be kicking in big time, right? Doing its thing, all right? All right, so we already talked about where, all right, the preganglionic neurons originate from, all right? And the off the brainstem and in the spinal cord, right? But I want to talk about the two types of ganglia, okay? The first one is the terminal ganglia, because remember what I said. In the parasympathetic division, you are going to have the autonomic ganglia either close to the effector organ or actually within the effector organ. If it's close, then we refer to that as a terminal ganglia. If it's literally inside the effector organ, in the wall of the organ, perfect example, like your large intestine or small intestine, okay, then we call that an intramural ganglia. Intra within, mural being wall, okay? Intramural ganglia. Okay, so there's two types of ganglia when we're talking about the parasympathetic division. Okay, one that's close, and then one that's inside. Good so far? All right, I feel like I'm going too slow. I should probably speed this up. All right. I'm kidding, I'm kidding. I'm joking. There's just so much information here. We got time. I had a student last night telling me their hands were cramping up taking notes from last night's class because we were going through a lot. All right, so let's review, all right, in a little bit more detail the four cranial nerves, all right? So, oculomotor, cranial nerve 3, facial, cranial nerve 7, glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve 9, and vagus, cranial nerve 10, okay? So I'm going to talk about where the preganglionic neurons or axons originate, all right, and then where we're going to find the ganglia, all right, and the name of the ganglia, and then what the postganglionic neurons actually control, okay? So pretty much for all the cranial nerves, it should be pretty easy in their origin, all right? The preganglionic neurons are always going, their cell bodies are going to originate in the brainstem. But I'm going to go now and be a little bit more specific. So ocular motor, all right, it's going to originate in the midbrain, okay? And then its axon is going to extend, all right, to the ciliary ganglion. Now, this will be easier to remember when we go over the anatomy of the eye because there's a couple of structures inside the eye called the ciliary something or other, okay? So it'll be easy to remember that way, all right? But the ganglion is actually inside your eye socket or the orbit. Okay, it's close to the eye. Because remember, all right, the preganglionic neuron, all right, is long. Okay, so the ganglia for the parasympathetic nervous system are going to be closer to the effector organ, or actually within the effector organ. Okay, so the postganglionic neuron is going to affect the ciliary muscles. All right, this is great because these are the muscles that actually help with what we call accommodation, and we'll talk about that in chapter 16. But when you have to focus on something that's close by, so if you're looking at the mountains in North Carolina when you're driving down Hayward Road, okay, and then your phone beeps, someone's texting you, and you glance over on your phone because you're not holding on to it, it's in the hand-free position. You glance over, who's texting me? So when your eyes go from that far away distance to your phone that's sitting there on your dashboard and you're able to read the person's name, all right, how the lens changes and how it focuses to that close object there, it's called accommodation, where you are actually utilizing these ciliary muscles because they change the shape of the lens. And then also, if you go into a dark room, or actually, what happens when you go into a bright room? If this room was 4 times brighter, how big would your pupil be? Do you know what the pupil is? The pupil is the opening there, that black opening in your eye. Would it be big or small? Small, right. Okay, I think we all know that the smaller the pupil, that's right. The smaller the pupil, less light gets in, because if you're in a bright light area, but if you're in a dark area, all right, if there was like a little light in the corner over there, this room was pretty dark, your pupil would be pretty big, okay? Well, the muscle that actually makes that pupil small is the pupillary sphincter muscle. All right, we'll talk about more about that, all right? So we call that the iris sphincter. So it causes, keep in mind, ocular motor, all right, cranial nerve number 3, causes pupillary constriction. It makes the pupil smaller. And how I remember it is during sympathetic stimulation, all right, your pupils get big, okay? So, you know, when someone is surprised by something, or if they get chased by a bear, if you ever see a cartoon, that person's eyes get big, or they're like, whoa, you know. So I always think, all right, when your eyes get big, the pupils get big because fight or flight. So parasympathetic is opposite of that, so the pupil gets smaller. All right, the second cranial nerve is cranial nerve number 7, okay, facial nerve. Same thing. Preganglionic neurons are going, their cell bodies originate in the midbrain, or excuse me, in the brainstem, but specifically in the pons. Okay, and it's going to go out to 2 different ganglia, right? Pterygopalatine and the submandibular. Okay, so the first one, the pterygopalatine ganglion, is going to control the lacrimal gland. That's the gland that creates tears. Okay, so facial, cranial nerve 7 controls your tears, your lacrimal gland there. And then also the glands in your nose and mouth. Remember the hard palate? Okay, that's another way that you can remember that it's going to stimulate secretion of some of the glands in your nose and mouth. I just think, well, the nose is above the hard palate and the mouth is below the hard palate. That's one way that you can think about it. Then the postganglionic axons for the submandibular. Now, this is not supposed to say gland, by the way. This is supposed to say ganglion. Okay, that's supposed to say ganglion. So the postganglionic axons from the submandibular ganglion are going to control submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. Okay, so when you start to salivate, because you start thinking about what you're going to have for dinner or lunch or breakfast and you're super hungry, okay, that's facial nerve. Okay, it is going to stimulate salivation in your mouth. Okay, it's going to have help from cranial nerve 9. Okay, but we'll talk about that in a second. All right, speaking of cranial nerve 9, here it is. So the preganglionic cell bodies are going to be found again in the brainstem, but in this time it's going to be in the medulla oblongata. And so they're going to go and synapse in the otic ganglion. Okay, that's going to be close to your ear, and then that's going to stimulate the parotid salivary gland. Okay. The parotid is the largest of the salivary glands. It's close to your ear, along the ramus. It's just in front of it. It's just anterior to your ear and along the ramus of your jaw. Okay. Now vagus is a little bit more complicated. Bless you. Yes. Has anyone ever had it where they're about to sneeze and someone walks over and rubs their nose? I hate that because then I can't sneeze. It stops me from sneezing.
Oh, my mom would just say, well, I was about to say, bless you before I sneeze. I'm like,
yeah. No. My wife does that to me all the time. She'll run over when I'm about to sneeze and rub my nose. I'm like, thanks. I feel like now I'm lost. All right. Vagus nerve. It originates in the medulla, much like glossopharyngeal, okay? And here's the thing. There are so many different ganglia that the vagus nerve, all right, the preganglionic neurons that the vagus nerve goes out to, we don't even list them here, all right? But what you do need to know is that all these ganglia are going to be found, all right, within the thorax and the abdomen, okay? Remember when we were going over the cranial nerves and I was telling you about the functions of vagus nerve, and it just pretty much controls many different aspects and organs of the thorax and the abdomen, okay? Well, that's what we see here. So the postganglionic neurons are going to go out and stimulate all these different organs, blood vessels, and tissues throughout your thorax and throughout your abdomen, okay? Some of the functions are regulating heart rate, okay? It's part of the parasympathetic. So the parasympathetic slows down the heart rate, okay? It's going to cause constriction, or what we call bronchioconstriction of the lung bronchioles. It's also, because it's part of the rest and digest division of the autonomic nervous system, it's going to increase digestion. Remember what I said. It also, the parasympathetic division helps to replenish, all right, nutrients and increase energy store. So it's going to stimulate the liver, all right, to undergo glycogenesis. Excuse me, I can't think today. Okay? So vagus does a lot. All right, that's the cranial portion. Let's jump into the sacral division, okay, the bottom part. All right, so when we're talking about the sacral division, we're going to speak about the pelvic splanchnic nerves, okay? So the pelvic splanchnic nerves get their spinal cord innervation, all right, from spinal nerves S2 through S4. Okay? And so these pelvic splanchnic nerves are going to transmit, all right, these neurons to the terminal, which are the close by ganglia, and the intramural, which are the inside ganglia. Okay? We're not going to get into too much detail about this, but these postganglionic neurons are then going to stimulate, all right, effector tissues in the abdomen and the pelvic areas, mainly smooth muscle, okay, and some glandular tissue there, okay? So everything that has to do with digestion, okay, urination, defecation, it's also going to stimulate some of our reproductive activities there, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, okay?
What's the nerve that makes you pass out in the hospital? Is that the
Vagus, yeah, it's what do they call it? Vagal response. There's another term that what'd you say?
thing like that?
Yeah. Did you ever watch the show Scrubs? Oh, okay.
I've heard of it.
There was an episode in which one of the characters was suffering from that, and every time that they went to the bathroom, that they would pass out on the toilet.
I had
So-
a patient do that in the shower. He went like, oh, and he made like this grunt noise,
Yep.
and then he just went limp.
Yep.
And, like he was like that for like an hour.
Yep.
It, like scared the hell out of me.
There's it's the vagus response, but I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on this right now. I don't know why, but anyways, it'll come to me. But it's a response in which you ask the person to bear down like they're going to go to the bathroom and poop. All right, but obviously don't do that. But you increase your intra-abdominal pressure, and that actual response, if they do that, it can cause them to pass out because of that vagal response. All right, so look, if you look here, this is just kind of showing you everything that I just talked about, okay, just in pictures. So you can see here are the cranial nerves and all the different ganglia that they're going to innervate, okay? And then down here, all right, you can see the pelvic splanchnic nerves, all right, which are the S2 through 4 divisions of the spinal cord, and then pretty much all of the different structures that they innervate, okay? So a lot of it has to do with structures in the abdominal cavity and structures in the pelvic cavity here, okay? So if you just kind of want to get a little bit of an appreciation, okay, take a glance at this. And this will kind of show you, and you can see here, all right, the preganglionic neurons, all right, are the long division here. And then the postganglionic, all right, they're closer to the effector organs, right? You can see here in the heart, down here in the lungs, and a lot in here in the digestive systems. Okay, let's talk about the sympathetic. Boom. Okay, fight or flight. Okay, it is going to originate in T1 through L2, right? The preganglionic cell bodies are located in the lateral gray horns of T1 through L2, thoracolumbar origin there, okay? But in this scenario, right, all the ganglia are close to the spinal cord, the central nervous system, okay? But yes, like it says up there, the anatomical pathways are complex. So we're going to walk you through it, okay? So I'm going to start off with just kind of a general overview, and then I'm going to get a little bit more specific here, all right? So jumping into what I said, okay, the cell bodies are going to be located in the gray matter there in the lateral horns of T1 through L2. They are myelinated, okay, but they're just small. right? So these preganglionic neurons are going to travel to a ganglion, okay? The main, not the main ganglia, but the one that we saw in lab, that's the sympathetic trunk, okay? That's just outside, and it runs parallel to the spine, okay, and the spinal cord. And then we'll talk about the remaining ganglia here, okay? So like I said, think of that sympathetic trunk as a pearl necklace, okay? So the pearls, okay, the swellings there are going to be where all the cell bodies are being synapsed on. And then the string portion are just the axons that are running down, okay, from one ganglia to the next ganglia. I'll quickly show you a picture of right here. Okay, this here is the sympathetic trunk. So you got the ganglia here, where all the cell bodies and all the synapsing is going on, but then you've got the string portion here, and that's just where axons are going to be running in. Okay? All right. So a concept that I want you to understand is think of each ganglia, all right, that's going to be associated with each spinal nerve that's coming off in those regions there. Okay? So when we were labeling on Tuesday, you know, we learned about the different nerve plexuses, all right? We had the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and did I say sacral? And sacral plexus, okay? Well, up in the cervical area, okay, you have, all right, we labeled up in the neck there the 3 cervical ganglia. The superior, which was the largest, the middle, and the inferior. The middle being the smallest, and then the inferior just kind of being right in the middle. All right, so the superior cervical ganglion is going to innervate, all right, all of the viscera in the thorax, but it's also going to innervate the tissues in the head and the neck. Okay? So some of those tissues are going to be sweat glands. Okay? Blood vessels, you're going to find out, is under sympathetic innervation and not under parasympathetic innervation. So only the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system controls the diameter of your blood vessels. Okay? The parasympathetic does not have a role in that. Okay? When we were talking about the ocular motor nerve and how it controls the iris, the sphincter pupillae, the muscle that causes the iris to become smaller, all right? Well, here in the sympathetic, we have the dilator pupillae muscle. And that's the muscle that makes the iris bigger, okay? Or the it makes the pupil bigger, okay? So we can let more light in. And then we also have the superior tarsal muscle. That's the muscle that helps to elevate your eyelid, okay? And in the middle and the inferior, all right, those postganglionic neurons are going to innervate your thoracic viscera. Okay, lungs, heart, blood vessels down in there, and some of the other tissues in there. All right, so here you can see all right, these right here are going to be your cervical ganglia. And so they're going to innervate, all right, the superior cervical ganglion is going to innervate, all right, up in the head, in the neck there, all right, and some of the glands. And then the middle and inferior, all right, are going to innervate the thoracic viscera there, heart, lungs, okay, tissues down there too, okay? Now you can see we're going to jump into what innervates the rest of this stuff. Here's a picture of the sympathetic chain or trunk, all right, in a live dissection. All right. So here you can see on either side, here's the sympathetic trunk right here. Okay, and then here's a ganglia, here's another ganglia, here's another ganglia, here's another ganglia. But those ganglia are going to be pretty much at each spinal nerve level. So if you have a spinal nerve coming off at T10, you'll have a T10 sympathetic trunk ganglia right there. Okay. So we learned about remember the rami communicantes? So you have the spinal nerve, okay, which is a mixed nerve, and it exits out of the intervertebral foramen. And then there's a branch that comes off the spinal nerve that goes towards your back, and that's called the dorsal ramus or the posterior ramus, which innervates the deep muscles of your back and the skin on your back. And then the other branch that continues on, that's called the anterior ramus or the ventral ramus, okay? Well, you are going to have, all right, two small branches, all right, that come off the spinal nerve, all right, that allows the spinal nerve to communicate to the sympathetic trunk. We call those the rami communicantes, all right? And there's two of them. You have a white rami communicantes and a gray rami communicante. This is easy to remember because remember, nervous tissue, if it's white, it's myelinated, okay? And we learned when we were talking about the lower motor neurons for the autonomic system there, okay, that the only myelinated neuron is the preganglionic neuron. So in the white rami communicantes, you will only find preganglionic neurons there. And they come off of the lateral gray horns, okay, so it's going to be T1 through L2. So we consider this, we nickname it the entrance ramp to the trunk. Okay? And then the other rami is the gray rami communicantes. It's gray because it's unmyelinated, all right? And we remember, all right, that only postganglionic, all right, neurons are unmyelinated. So they're going to be coming from the trunk going to the spinal nerve. So it's the exit ramp. We nickname it the exit ramp. It's leaving the trunk and going to the spinal nerves. This will make a little bit more sense when we go over some of these pathways here. Listen, well, no, I'll wait. I want to show you a picture, but I'll wait. Okay, so let's talk about, we're going to go in more detail. I'm going to show you the pathways here, but I want to talk about the splanchnic nerves and then our prevertebral ganglia, okay? All right, so the sympathetic splanchnic nerves, all right, these guys are actually, when they go into the sympathetic trunk, all right, they're going to come off the front side of the sympathetic trunk. Okay, so let me back up a little bit. First of all, we're going to start off with the preganglionic sympathetic neurons that are going to enter into the sympathetic trunk, but they will not, you need to know this, they will not synapse there. Okay, so they enter, they come from the spinal nerve, enter in through the white rami communicantes, they don't synapse in the trunk, and they leave through the anterior portion of the trunk. I'm going to go into more detail on this. And then they'll go and directly synapse onto what we call a prevertebral ganglia. That's where they synapse. Okay? And then from the prevertebral ganglia, all right, they'll go to the effector organ. So we're going to learn about a couple of the prevertebral ganglia. There's 4 that I want to talk about. Okay? So they're located, all right, in front of the sympathetic trunk there, okay? All these ganglia are going to be found within the abdominal pelvic cavity, and they'll all be associated with the aorta. So each ganglia is named after a blood vessel. Now I know, and here's the thing, it'd be nice if you knew this because when you do the circulatory system, you would know all the blood vessels, but you have to wait till 211, so we'll just... But all these ganglia are named after a blood vessel that comes off of your abdominal aorta, okay? Okay. The first one is the celiac ganglia, okay, which is associated with the celiac artery. It's also known as the celiac trunk. It literally sits, all right? Here's the diaphragm, the descending abdominal aorta. Once it pierces through the diaphragm, it has this blood vessel that comes right off the front, okay? And that's called the celiac trunk, and then it gives off 3 branches, okay? One goes towards the spleen, one goes towards the stomach, and then the other one goes towards the liver. But anyways, adjacent to the celiac trunk is this ganglia, okay? And it allows, right, these greater thoracic splanchnic nerves, they enter into the ganglia, okay, synapse, and then the postganglionic axons are going to innervate the stomach, right, your duodenum, the first part of your small intestine, spleen, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. The superior mesenteric ganglia is actually named after the next blood vessel on the descending abdominal aorta. It's a big blood vessel. It supplies a significant portion of your intestines, okay? So the lesser and least thoracic splanchnic nerves, all right, will enter into the ganglia, and then the postganglionic neurons will innervate the small intestine, okay, the ileum and the jejunum, the large intestine, pancreas, kidneys, and the ureters. And then lastly, inferior mesenteric ganglia, which is another branch off of the abdominal aorta, the inferior mesenteric artery, okay? And the lumbar splanchnic nerves enter into this ganglia, and then the postganglionic axons are going to affect the large intestine, the rectum, the urinary bladder, more of the ureters, and then your reproductive organs there. All right, we're going to go into more detail on this in a second. Just what you wanted, right? No, Dr. Kaz, no more detail. But let's take a break and talk about a pathology, okay? If you were to lesion, okay, so, one of the structures, all right, of the cervical sympathetic trunk, or even, all right, your T1 ganglion, you will have this condition called Horner syndrome. Has anyone ever heard of Horner syndrome? Okay. So when you lesion the sympathetic division, all right, of the autonomic nervous system, essentially anything that is sympathetic will not work anymore, which means the parasympathetic will be expressed more, okay? So for example, okay, the sympathetic, the superior cervical ganglion, okay, helps to control, all right, that superior tarsal muscle. Remember that muscle I was telling you that raises the eyelid? Well, if we lesion that and it can't raise the eyelid, then you get this condition called ptosis. There's a P in front of it, but it's silent. All right, and you get a drooping of the eyelid, okay, because you can no longer control that eyelid. I learned when we were learning about Horner syndrome, we called it the ptosis, the osis sisters, because you have ptosis, meiosis, and anhidrosis. All right. So in this scenario here, cats get Horners. They look. I didn't know that a cat could get Horners. Cats are crazy. I'm not a cat person, and I don't want you to think that I don't like cats. I do like cats, but I had a neighbor. She see it after dentistry. She had. I'm not lying to you. You could walk by this lady's house. Nice lady. She was a massage therapist, but she was an animal rescue fanatic. And I respect people that have big hearts for rescue animals. But in the summertime, walk by her house. You could be 3 houses away, and you could smell the kitty litter. Unfortunately, she had a fire in her basement. Now, the house didn't burn down, but the firefighters had to go in there. They counted over 50 cats. 50 cats! And unfortunately, a couple of them died in the fire, but we had an answer to what our question was. I mean, we knew she had cats in there. You know how that commercial, how many licks does it take to get to a center of a Tootsie Roll Pop? Well, how many cats does it take to stink of kitty litter 3 houses away? All right, it takes about 50. It was nasty. Nasty, nasty.
Do you have any cats? Like, are you allowed to have like 50 cats? I mean,
No one knew. Like, no one could tell. She had a sunroom on the back of her house, and she was 2 houses over from us. And so we talked to the next door neighbor. We're like, did you guys ever see? We're like, yeah, we counted 20, but that's as many as they thought that were out there. But apparently she had a ton in the house. And a client was 60. Yeah, it's crazy. And it's not like she was a weirdo or anything. She just had a big heart, and she just rescued.
That's a lot of cat food.
A lot of cat litter, cat food. Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. The second symptom for Horner's is meiosis here. Right. So remember, when we cut away the sympathetic function, the parasympathetic function takes over. So that person will then have a constricted pupil, because remember, pupil constriction comes from the parasympathetic, from the pupillae sphincter muscle, because the dilating muscle no longer works. So the pupil then constricts. And hydrosis, this one kind of sucks because you can't sweat. All right. So not all the sweat glands, but just the sweat glands that are innervated by the cervical region. So you might notice that you can't sweat on your head or your neck. It's really crazy. Okay. And then facial flushing, because like I said, vasodilation and vasoconstriction are solely controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So when you take that away, those blood vessels will immediately vasodilate, just pop open. Nothing. When I say pop open, they just open all the way. So more blood flow goes there, and obviously you have a lot of blood vessels that go to your head and neck and face, so they appear flushed. Pretty cool. All right. So we're going to talk about now the 4 different types, all right, of pathways for the sympathetic trunk. Okay. So this is going to follow, all right, what happens now, because we saw, all right, you got your preganglionic neuron that goes from the spinal cord, and it's going to go into the sympathetic trunk, right? And then it can synapse in there. It might not synapse in there, all right? But we're going to talk about what happens to, all right, the neurons that leave the sympathetic trunk. The first one here is the spinal nerve pathway, okay? So this is going to affect any of the effectors in the skin. That includes sweat glands, right? Smooth muscles, all that stuff in the skin, okay? All right. Also, all right, it's going to affect all the tissues of the neck, your torso, and your limbs. That's a lot, okay? Think of the dermatomes. All right. So simple, I won't say a simple story, but it all begins with the preganglionic neuron, all right, which originates in the lateral gray horn. Okay, it's going to leave the spinal cord, and it's going to enter into the sympathetic trunk through the white rami. Okay, so it enters in, and then it's going to synapse with a ganglionic neuron. So in our picture here, I want to show you there's a couple different, come on now, a couple different possibilities. All right. All right, so here you can see, here's our preganglionic neuron, the cell body. Okay, it exits out of the spinal cord. It enters into the sympathetic chain. Okay, now it's got 3 options. Okay, it can synapse with the postganglionic neuron on that same level. Then that postganglionic neuron will exit on that same level. Okay, so if this is T5, okay, the postganglionic neuron will exit on T5. That's one option. The preganglionic neuron can enter into this to the sympathetic trunk, all right? Not synapse on anything. It can go up 1 level, 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels, whatever. Okay? So it can ascend and go up and then synapse. So it could enter into, this could be T12. Okay? So the T12 preganglionic neuron enters into the sympathetic chain on T12 level, and then it can ascend all the way up to T5. But once it synapses, it has to leave on that level. So if it synapses on the T5 level, it's gone. It's leaving on the T5 level. Okay? Or, last one, what goes up must come down. Well, in this case, we're seeing where the spinal nerve, we'll do T12 again. okay? So this preganglionic neuron, okay, enters into the sympathetic chain at T12, and then it can go down to like L1, L2. Synapse, but then once it synapses, it has to leave. So it's really kind of cool, because if you lesion certain parts of your spinal cord, all right, because these spinal nerves go up and down in the sympathetic chain, all right, the extent of the damage, the effects might not be as bad, okay? So you can see how for the spinal nerve pathway, you have choices, you have options, okay? So that preganglionic neuron, once it enters into the sympathetic trunk, it can synapse and leave on the same level, it can ascend and synapse and leave at that level, or it can descend and synapse and leave at a level, okay? So that's what the postganglionic axon, it's going to exit through that gray ramus, but it has to be at that same level as the ganglion that at which it's synapsed at, okay? Once it leaves at that level, okay, it's going to go out to the effector. And that's what this drawing is showing you, okay? Goes out. This is showing you it leaving through the posterior or dorsal ramus, affecting the blood vessel there, but it leaves back out to that spinal nerve and affects the tissues on the same level. All right, that's the first pathway. The second pathway, all right, is going to be, did I skip one? No, okay. This is the postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway here. Did I skip? Okay, no. All right, sorry. All right, this is the second pathway, the postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway. All right, so same story. The preganglionic is going to enter, okay, and then it's going to, once it synapses, all right, it will then leave that sympathetic trunk, all right, and go directly to the effector. But in this case, all right, it's not going to leave through the gray ramus, okay? Remember how I said if it leaves through the gray ramus, it goes back into the spinal nerve and then exit to the effector? This one, it will not, all right? Let me show you the picture. I like this picture much better. Okay, so in this scenario here, it enters into the sympathetic chain, okay, but it does not leave through the gray ramus. It will come out anteriorly, okay, through the front. So it can still ascend and then exit, or descend and exit, but it is going to come out through the front. It does not leave through the gray ramus here, okay? And that's the postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway. It is going to innervate, all right, organs in the neck and their chest, all right, heart, esophagus, and then again, skin effectors along the head and neck, and then also, all right, our eyelid, the superior tarsal muscle, and then the dilator pupillae muscles, okay? All right, splanchnic nerve pathway. All right, the splanchnic nerve pathway is going to involve effector organs in the abdominal region and in the pelvis, okay? Important that you know this. The preganglionic axon or neuron will not synapse inside the sympathetic trunk. There's no synapsing. But what it'll do is it will actually leave the trunk and synapse outside of the trunk in what we call the prevertebral ganglia. All those ganglia I just named off, the celiac, all right, the superior mesenteric, the inferior mesenteric, those are our prevertebral ganglia, okay? So it'll travel to those ganglia, synapse in those ganglia, okay, near the aorta, and then from those ganglia, the postsynaptic neurons will then head towards the different effectors, all right, throughout your abdomen and pelvic viscera there, okay? So here's, well, I went back one. There's the splanchnic nerve one. All right, so here you see the preganglionic neuron enters into the sympathetic trunk, does not synapse, will leave anteriorly out through the front, and it'll find one of the prevertebral ganglia. Okay, celiac ganglia, superior mesenteric ganglia, synapse there, and then the postsynaptic, all right, ganglia will then innervate the effector organ from there. And the final one here, the adrenal medulla pathway, this one here is a direct route. Okay, adrenal medulla, well, first of all, the adrenal gland secretes several different types of hormones. You'll learn most of those, or well, pretty much all of those, in chapter 17 and 211. But we know it to secrete adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Those are our fight or flight hormones. Those are the hormones that give us supernatural speed or strength. You know, you always hear about the mom lifting the car off her child, right? And it's that epinephrine that helps with that. Well, the part of the adrenal gland that produces the epinephrine, all right, is the adrenal medulla. Your adrenal gland looks like a glob, just kind of like that. Okay? And at the center of it is the medulla. The outside is called the cortex. Okay? So the hormones that are produced by the adrenal medulla are called epinephrine and norepinephrine. We talked about norepinephrine briefly here at the beginning of this chapter because it's also a neurotransmitter. Okay? So what happens here are preganglionic neurons, all right, will enter into the sympathetic trunk, all right? They will not synapse with the sympathetic trunk. They will not synapse in a prevertebral ganglia. They go directly to the adrenal medulla, okay? And they will directly stimulate, they're called the neurosecretory cells, all right, that they live inside the adrenal medulla, all right? But they will directly stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So if you look here, all right, remember what I said, a synapse slows down our nerve signal. Well, guess what? There's not a single synapse along this whole route. Okay? And when time is of the essence, all right, that fight or flight response is of the essence, all right? You know, it doesn't want to cause you harm and whatnot. We're not slowed down because there isn't a single synapse in that whole pathway there. That's the easiest one. Just travels through everything. Okay? Goes through the sympathetic chain, nothing. Goes through the prevertebral ganglion, nothing. Goes right there to the medulla, all right, to the adrenal medulla to stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. All right. You guys tired of the pathways? I'm sure you are. Let's talk about some cool stuff. Okay? Let's talk about autonomic tone. All right? I like autonomic tone. Okay? Because this is stuff that we all can get on board with. Okay? First of all right, keep in mind that the autonomic nervous system, all right, and its two divisions, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, all right, most of those effectors are going to be innervated, all right, by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, okay? Some, like I said before, for example, your blood vessels are innervated by one division, sympathetic, okay? But these divisions, all right, will not consistently, but constantly, all right, release neurotransmitter. So they're going to be stimulating those effectors, okay? When you release more neurotransmitter, you'll get more stimulation of the effector. When you release less neurotransmitter, you'll get less stimulation of the effector, okay? So this continuous release of the neurotransmitter, we call that autonomic tone, okay? So this goes back to me talking about the blood vessels, vasodilation and vasoconstriction, okay? So one division, that's going to be the sympathetic nervous system, all right, is going to stimulate our blood vessel tone, okay? So basically what happens is we're sitting here and minding our own business and taking notes and listening to me talk, right? Most of your blood vessels are in a partially constricted state, okay? And so that maintains your normal blood pressure and your normal blood flow, okay? So now comes a time where maybe you start to exercise and some of your tissues need more blood flow, okay, because you're working out. So we need to increase blood flow. So in order to do that, we are going to vasodilate the blood vessels. So when we vasodilate the blood vessels, all we do is decrease the sympathetic activity. We turn it down a little bit. We tone it down a little bit. So when the sympathetic neurons are releasing less neurotransmitter, they're going to stimulate the smooth muscles in the blood vessels, causing them to relax more, causing the blood vessel to vasodilate. Now, if we want to do the opposite, if we want to decrease the blood flow, say it's cold outside, we want to decrease the blood flow to our skin, okay, then our sympathetic nervous system will then increase the release of neurotransmitter, thereby increasing the vasomotor tone and causing the blood vessels to vasoconstrict. And that will decrease the blood flow, okay? So vasoconstriction occurs when we get an increase in sympathetic activity. Vasodilation is when we get a decrease in sympathetic activity, okay? So we call that vasomotor tone. And that has to do with the sympathetic nervous system all by itself. All right. Vagal tone is when the vagus nerve, all right, stimulates, or not stimulates, all right, but it will actually innervate the heart, excuse me, thereby decreasing the heart rate. Okay? Sympathetic activity will increase the heart rate. All right, let's take a break. I can see people's eyes are glazing over. I could go on and on and on and talk about this, but I know this is a lot. We'll pick this up and finish this next week. All right, so folks at home,